Today we're going to explore percents. Let's look at this hundreds grid. It has 100 small squares, and the whole grid represents one whole. There's 4 different ways we can describe the green part of the grid. First thing we can do is count how many squares are green. Each row is 10, so 10, 20, 30, 40, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 45 out of 100. So we can put it in words. We could also write a fraction. 45 hundredths are green. We could write a decimal. 45 hundredths are green. And finally, we could write a percent using the percent symbol. 45% of the grid is green. It's relatively easy to find the percent when you're using a hundreds grid because there are 100 small pieces. But what do you do if it's a different fraction? Here I have a fraction circle, and each piece represents 1/10. So I'm going to take away a couple of the pieces. And now we have 8/10 left over. So we would write it as a fraction, 8/10. We could write it as a decimal, 8/10. But how would we write it as a percent? Well, you have to convert because percent means out of 100. So if we have 8/10 and we want to know how much that would be out of 100, we would convert the numerator and denominator. 10 times 10 equals 100. So do the same thing to the numerator, 8 times 10, and you get 80. Once you've done that, it's easy to figure out the percent. 80 over 100 is 80%, because this over 100 means percent. In this example, I'm using fourths, and I have 3/4 here. So to write it as a fraction, we would write 3/4. Now, to write it as a decimal or a percent, we will have to convert it. So let's look at 3/4, and we want to say percent, so that means out of 100. 4 times what is 100? 25. So we do the same thing to the numerator, times 25. 3 times 25 is 75 out of 100. Now it's easy to figure out the percent, 75%. What if we already know the percent and we want to convert it to a fraction and a decimal? Well, we can convert it by saying 15%. That means 15 out of 100. So we would write it like this, 15 out of 100. And to write that as a decimal, we have 15 hundredths. So we would write it like this. Next one, 6%. Percent means out of 100. So we have 6 out of 100. And if we want to put that as a decimal, we have 6 hundredths. Now don't forget, if you have 6 hundredths, we need to have a placeholder here in the 10th spot, and we put the 6 in the hundredth spot. Let's do another one. 79% means 79 out of 100. Convert to a decimal, you have 79 hundredths. 64%, 64 out of 100. Convert to a decimal, 64 hundredths. Let's go back to our initial sample. And if we had to write this as a fraction with hundredths, we would write 45 hundredths. A decimal, we would write 45 hundredths. And a percent, we would write 45%. But what if I asked you to represent the unshaded part? Well, how many of the little squares are unshaded? the total has to equal 100. So if there are 45 shaded, that tells us that there are 55 that are unshaded, because 45 plus 55 equals 100. So our fraction with hundreds would be 55 hundredths. Our decimal would be 55 hundredths, and our percent would be 55%. Always notice that the total needs to add up to 100. 45 plus 55 equals 100%.